Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, and everyone online. It's a great day here in Bonn at the Global Landscapes Forum, and I'm here from UN Environment. My name's Diana Kopansky, and I have the honor of leading the Global Peatlands Initiative. It's an initiative to save the peatlands of the world as the largest organic carbon stock. Peatlands matter for the climate. Estimations suggest that while peatlands cover only 3% of the global land surface, they store over 500 billion tons of carbon, and that carbon is equivalent to all that is contained in terrestrial biomass and twice the amount of the world's forests. Current greenhouse gas estimates from drained or burning peatlands are 5% of anthropogenic emissions, and when they're burning, that can go up to 10%. These are powerful carbon sinks, and they're long-term carbon stores that have been transformed to other types of land use. Peatlands matter for the people around the world. In addition to the role they play in climate change mitigation and adaptation through this carbon they store, they contribute significantly to biodiversity conservation, water regime, water quality and regulation, and other ecosystem services. So really immediate action is needed to prevent their further degradation and destruction. There are many existing options, and we're going to tell you a few about a few of them. Peatlands matter for the planet. More than 180 countries of the world are believed to have peatlands, and we're only starting to understand the role that they play, and even where they are. In 2017, international team of scientists estimated the Cuvette Centrale peatlands of the Congo Basin. This is actually a picture courtesy of NASA and Roberta Bondar of the Cuvette Centrale peatlands. It's the size of England and holds close to 15 years worth of US emissions. So there's over 30 gigatons of carbon stored there, locked in. Keeping peak carbon in the ground is critical for the world to meet the target of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and to help to keep the global average temperature under 2 degrees Celsius. So we need to do things business unusual. And that's why we're here. The Global Peatlands Initiative was a team of 13 core founding partners calling for urgent action and collaboration on peatlands. And since the end of 2016, we've grown to 28 different organizations strong. We work and support directly the countries of Indonesia, the Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Peru, and we're kindly supported by the International Climate Initiative, the German government. Smoke on Water was a publication, a call to action, and a cry for help. And it has a number of recommendations in it that I think everyone can relate to. And early this year, all countries of the world called for this action, for the conservation and sustainable management of peatlands, to work together jointly and with many stakeholders to actually advance and share information and knowledge and the science needed to actually make good decisions. We're here today to talk about another area of peatlands that maybe many of you haven't thought about yet. It's the global north, the far north. We're talking about keeping it cool and how these amazing peatlands do their job in actually keeping permafrost cool. So I'd love to invite my speakers up to the stage. Hans Justin from Greifswald-Meares Center, Yannick Bedouin from David Suzuki Foundation, Tatiana Minyeva from Care for Ecosystems and Wetlands International, Daria Ryadzantseva from EthnoExpert, Candice Patterson, an Inuit representative from far north Canada. And do we have Batchagal? Not here yet. We'll call him from the floor. We have the honor of having Batchagal, who is a special envoy for climate change in Mongolia, who will also speak about what's happening in his country. So today our presentation is going to focus on 3 regions: the Arctic, the Kola Peninsula in Siberia, and the permafrost peatlands of Mongolia. We're also here today to launch the Frontiers publication. So every few years, UN Environment Program calls out to over 500 scientists and all countries of the world with a survey. And they basically name their top 10 emerging issues. And this time they put peatlands on that list. And we felt, as a Global Peatlands Initiative partners, it was time to talk about the North, about the permafrost melting, about the Arctic, and about the challenges that people are facing in this changing environment. So welcome, everyone. I'd like to invite Hans to tell us more about the science of permafrost peatlands.
Okay.
That's a bit noisy, that one.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. I want to tell you a little bit about a cool relationship that exists between peatlands and permafrost. If the machine works. Yeah. If you do not yet believe in climate change, this graph will convince you. It was produced this week and was just published by BBC. This is the change of temperatures since 1900 until now in all countries of the world, alphabetically ordered along the continents. We see everywhere climate is changing in the last decades. In the Arctic, temperatures are rising twice as fast as global average. And it is therefore interesting because the northern circumpolar region holds almost half of the world's soil organic carbon. Much of that is in mineral soils, as we call them, buried by cryoturbation, but a substantial part of that carbon exists in the form of permanently frozen peat. Here this is a map that we made for the Frontier publication of UNEP, where we have laid over the peatland distribution over the permafrost distribution. Peatlands and permafrost have a dialectic relationship. Permafrost shapes peatland and peatland shapes permafrost. And the processes are a little bit different where you are in the Arctic. In the high Arctic, permafrost formation co-determines peat accumulation. In the middle and low Arctic, permafrost formation facilitates peat accumulation. And in the subarctic, permafrost formation requires peat accumulation. I will shortly illustrate that. In the dry desert high Arctic, peat formation only occurs where plant productivity is boosted by fertilization, specifically by birds. The peat is then directly, non-water saturated, conserved by permafrost. In the middle and low Arctic, permafrost prevents meltwater loss in summer because there is an impervious layer from permafrost below, whereas ice wedges obstruct surficial water flow. Both processes facilitate peat formation. And in the subarctic, permafrost only occurs under very special conditions, primarily in peatlands. That is the so-called zone of discontinuous permafrost. In one area, you have next to each other permafrost, the elevated parts, and non-permafrost parts. This has to do with the fact that dry peat has a very low thermal conductivity. And wet and frozen peat has a thermal conductivity that is 5 and 25 times higher. This means that dry peat in summer acts as an insulator, obstructing summer heat flow, whereas wet and frozen peat in winter allows winter cold to get in. This one-way cold pump, it is called the thermal diode, creates and protects permafrost in places where it otherwise could not exist, even at mean annual air temperatures of plus 2 degrees centigrade, we find permafrost. This illustrates that permafrost is not only the result of cold air temperatures, but depends on various complex interacting landscape components. And specifically, peatlands have a lot of these interacting landscape components: vegetation, peat, water, and in case of the Arctic, also ice, which is not the same as water. We have illustrated these processes a little bit in the Frontiers 2018-2019 graph. The interference of peat, plants, and water that influence the existence or non-existence of permafrost. In permafrost, there are also several positive feedbacks. It is this battle between ice and water. They want to destroy each other. Ice wants to destroy water, and water wants to destroy ice. And if they cannot win, they join the others. This leads to very contrasting developments and also to very rapid changes. And these rapid changes, specifically permafrost degradation, is currently most evident in the most peatland, carbon-rich, discontinuous permafrost zone. There we see changing patterns of permafrost in green, thermokarst ponds, water in blue, and fen vegetation here over the last decades. This shows itself in the form of collapse scars, these white spots in permafrost peat plateaus that are surrounded by non-permafrost land. The phenomenon you have there is the phenomenon of the so-called drunken forests. When the permafrost melts, the surface drops because water takes less place than ice, and the trees fall over, like a drunken man in the ditch. But on the other hand, we see even now the formation of new permafrost mounds. Here in red arrows, a picture I made last year in Stordalen. This is the peatland that has been most investigated for peatland degradation, permafrost degradation in the world. But you see on the same spot, new permafrost development in the last years. So these contrasting processes make it difficult to understand what exactly is going on in the Arctic permafrost peatlands. Human interventions may affect various of the landscape components and in this way also affect the distribution of permafrost. We have, of course, human effects like climate change and sea level rise that, of course, have their influence on permafrost, like here in the coastal zone of northern Siberia, but we can only combat them on a worldwide scale. And the predictions are a little bit frightening. Climate scenarios for various climate scenarios of IPCC predict massive thawing of permafrost until 2099. Here in color, the different models that predict the persistence of permafrost in 2099, and in gray, the present-day permafrost is indicated. So we are going to lose, if nothing changes, a substantial amount of permafrost. But also other human activities on the spot may affect the permafrost. This is a nice example of how simply the removal of shrubs leads to a melting of permafrost. 4 years after the shrub cutting here in Kutaluk in northeastern Siberia, the surface has collapsed with 3 decimeters, collecting water which in itself is going to affect the permafrost. Another important process also subject to climate change is the incidence of fire, which destroys the insulating vegetation and soil layers. And this changing heat balance then starts thermokarst, the disappearance of permafrost. Here an example where the soil removal for a street has let the ice wedges melt, leaving these hummocky areas called baicherachis. And in the end, that is the way how you change a permafrost-based forest into a non-permafrost underlain lake. This happens within a few decades. It has been studied in time. Water, as I already said, is one of the frightening things for permafrost. Water accumulates because of its high heat capacity, a lot of summer heat, and it acts thus as a heat source in winter and affects the local distribution of permafrost, leading to large-scale permafrost collapse. And everything what influences the water, the hydrology, like infrastructure development for roads, oil pipelines, and other things, may affect the permafrost. Like here is illustrated by the progression of permafrost over time along the Prudhoe-based Pine Road in Alaska, which was constructed in 1969, and since you see the increase of thermokarst, the melting of ice wedges. So it is a complex situation there in the Arctic, and we do not know so much about it. It is a little bit frightening that 30% of all science with respect to permafrost and peatlands in the Arctic stems from a radius of 30 kilometers around two places. One is Abisko in North Sweden, and the other is Tulik in Alaska. We have no total overview about what is happening in the Arctic. And that is risky because we have so much carbon and so much change. The SWIPA report has identified a lot of knowledge gaps and research needs. We do not know exactly where the carbon is. We do not know the multiple interrelated feedbacks. We do not know how global warming will trigger the changes in the permafrost system, etc., etc. Still, a lot has to be known. But we also know that we have to be prudent. We can already give guidelines, and we will discuss this further today. In the Frontier publication, we have concluded the physical complexity of permafrost peatlands and the significant risks of their degradation and disruptions demand a holistic approach to land use planning and management. And this requires the integrated knowledge for planners and policymakers, modern science together with indigenous knowledge. That's where we have to go for. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hans. Indeed, and that's really the question we're here to ask each other and see as a partnership and as individuals with a passion for nature, how can we work together to actually advance that and to help people speak the same language. I'd like to invite Yannick up. Yannick's going to speak a little bit about, well, you've heard already how the science is changing. We'd love to hear a little bit more about the impacts of people that are living there. Yannick.
All right. Won't change the microphone. Good morning, everybody. My name is Yannick Baudouin. I'm the Director General for David Suzuki Foundation in Canada. So I thought today I'd just share with you some stories from Canada, linking a bit to what Hans started. Of course, in Canada, we sometimes think of ourselves as a northern Arctic country. We're really not. We have wonderful communities of Indigenous people in the north, but culturally, Canadians in the south don't even know really that we have this Arctic, and we certainly don't know a lot about it. The biggest awareness that's happened is more visual. You can certainly see a lot of images like this, where landscape itself is profoundly changing. I worked about 3 years in the high Arctic across the archipelago, and in those 3 years, year after year, was amazing already to see some of the incredible changes happening. Sometimes in the news you get, when infrastructure is affected, airports or some of the few paved roads or some of the buildings like this one in Shishmaref in Alaska actually, you get that visual representation again that something very quick is changing. The permafrost is thawing at an alarming rate. And that's affecting things, again, visually, but we're not always making that connection to what the deeper meaning might be. And the deeper meaning, from my perspective, is actually the livelihoods and the people that are directly affected, living there, and working there and deriving, again, livelihoods. And that's a big part of perhaps the story that we're here to tell today. I'm also looking at, and Hans just started that, so this is my quick overview because I actually want to get into really the good news part of the story. But again, that traditional knowledge link that we have, that we can work with and collaborate with, which for so long has simply been ignored and not used in any kind of sound planning or sound approaches. Unfortunately, with us, we'll have Candice later, who's able to show some fantastic examples of innovation going on in there. The foundation in particular, and I wanted to give an example outside the Arctic, we've been working very closely by being invited into a lot of First Nations communities. So we have our Inuit, the Inuit people working in the, living in the Arctic, but in First Nations areas south of the Arctic line in the boreal forest, we've had about 10, 15 years of incredible collaborations looking at how Indigenous-led conservation, true Indigenous-led conservation can really benefit and lead to proper stewardship of a lot of the lands. And of course, the boreal forest in Canada is also another big peatland sink, a big peatland area. So I wanted to share some examples of that. Some of the good news, in a way, that can happen if we really are serious. Certainly, as a government in Canada, there's a long journey still to go, but at least there's a lot of solid attempts and working and walking the path with our First Nation partners. There were, again, lots of literature out there on how this can be done over the years, and now it's been starting to put into practice, right? So you're seeing not just the acknowledging of Indigenous worldview, but really the embedding of it is the most important part. Also in New Zealand, there's a lot of great examples if any of you are from New Zealand. This is really a piece about how do you link up not just the habitats, the species in the area, the livelihoods, but also the climate connection, so protecting those carbon sinks. So how do you holistically look at this and not just pick out individual little pieces to have individual little policies? So really that holistic worldview has been the most beneficial piece here. And that then leads to not just creating parks and no-go zones, but really generative livelihoods. So what is true sustainability, right? There is a social component as well as an ecological component. And in the Canadian context, this is, again, part of a very long journey. There's a lot of work to do on the relationship, but it is this attempt to move towards a nation-to-nation relationship, a true one. And that, again, like I said, is a long journey. Our founder here celebrated this year 35 years, the anniversary of the Meares Island Tribal Park on the west coast. Again, an amazing area of success where you do have all the different, I hate to use the word stakeholders and rights holders, but the different people, it can be industry, government, the First Nations themselves, actually coming together and creating a really true co-relationship, co-management plan. And it's been one of the bigger successes for sure in the Canadian context. I think maybe some of you might have remembered from the 80s and 90s, the Clayoquot Sound areas, protecting the giant trees that were out on the west coast in the Haida Gwaii areas. I give an example from something going on. I finally found the name. Candace and I was trying to talk with Candace about the name, but there's this area that's been looked at in the high Arctic by Inuit communities and Inuit government. It's actually transnational, so this is an offshore area where the idea of Indigenous-led conservation is coming into play. It also goes into Greenland, and so there's a lot of different things going on. But on the Canadian side, there's a lot of support for this, and this could be a very great example of large-scale, binational or trinational, in this case, with the Inuit co-management approaches. I will move into a bit of an example. I was asked to speak a bit in the Frontiers article. There's something called the Ontario's Far North Act. And to give it a lot of credit, the Ontario's Far North Act was really designed with co-management and co-participation in mind with the First Nation communities of Ontario. And it was really perhaps a first big attempt by a government to come in and say, okay, we can't just pass environmental laws unilaterally anymore. We really have to rekindle that relationship and what it means to work with First Nations partners. So to give it some credit, there was a lot of a very well-intended effort it put together, and it was a pretty solid piece, right? A lot of significant roles for the First Nation, looking at protection of areas of cultural value in particular, and this is a huge area, 225,000 square kilometers in the Far North area, looking at how habitat protection has to be an interconnected thing, not just this isolations, looking at little pockets, but really interconnected. And really a big piece of it was looking at the ecological function and also recognizing the livelihoods that have to take place and should take place. One example, maybe the first one that came out, that also comes from the frontiers, but the Cat Lake, Slate Falls area did create a whole framework with the government of Ontario on how those areas would be co-managed and co-protected and et cetera, and sustainably developed as well. And so again, lots of positive in this, but like I said, it's a journey, and it's a long journey, of hundreds of years of one way of thinking that still has to change relationship-wise. So there's been a lot of pushback as well on what it truly means. And the biggest maybe example is, in the end of all this, if you've done your work and you've still done your consultation, you followed the UNDRIP principles, the challenge in Canada is the Crown, the government, still can override and decide unilaterally to allow something to happen, even in First Nation traditional territory. And that's still that last piece of the relationship that is not there yet, right? And so we worked a lot with the Nishabe Aski Nations, which again, you can see the side, the light green. This is a massive area. I think it's about the size of France and maybe the UK to put together. And these are communities all over that area that have been living there since time immemorial. And so for them, it's still about how do you change that relationship where if you truly are coming in for conservation, for looking at the boreal and the peatlands and the species, you are able to do it in a way that fully respects the traditional rights and sovereignty of the First Nations. So again, a good first step, lots of work still to do, and I hope we can all talk about it and push these things together. So it's a message, a little thank you from our founders.
Thank you. Thanks, Yannick. And I think what we'll do is we'll have Candice come up and tell us a little bit about the innovation that's going on, how she's been working in her community to advance the monitoring and also the understanding and help to bridge between Indigenous traditional knowledge and scientists' perspectives. Candice, thanks.
Awesome, thank you. I have a bit of a cold, so please bear with me. Candice Peterson. Good morning, my name is Candice Peterson, and today I'm going to be talking about the Siku app. And this app is currently in beta testing at the moment, but once it reaches its full potential, it's going to be a great example of how Inuit Qayumaytukangit, which is traditional knowledge, it's going to be a very good example of how Inuit are adapting to a changing world using technology and Inuit Qayumaytukangit, which is traditional knowledge, to address the changes and promote safer hunting and traveling. Scientists have always been good at documenting everything, and Inuit history is based on oral history. And Inuit have often had to prove Inuit Qayumaytukangit because we are told our knowledge is anecdotal. And this app is providing self-determination for Inuit and allowing Inuit to design our own programs for environmental stewardship and share our knowledge with the younger generations. So just to give you a little bit of background about this app, it was created by the Arctic Eider Society and the community of Sanikiluaq to facilitate Inuit self-determination in research, education, and environmental stewardship. The idea for this app was inspired by Facebook pages such as Nunavut Hunting Stories of the Day, and Nunavut Hunting Stories of the Day was created because Inuit wanted to share their knowledge and stories with each other. And for the past 2 years, different communities have developed, tested, and refined the platform features and content. Most recently, members of the Gagvi program, such as myself, have helped beta test it. And if you're not sure which one's me, I'm the one on the left in the photo. So Siku is a mobile app and platform for accessing, storing, and sharing information. This is a preview of the platform. You can see many sources of information can be stored. On the left is a feed to share weather and ice conditions, user wildlife observations, and hunting stories. Each observation is connected to a user profile and project profile. You can see who made the profile and what other places they're associated with, and you could actually go into the profile of people and see what specific things they're involved in. On the right is a map with icons and user and location of each observation. Overlaid is a map with satellite imagery. Here I'm showing imagery of a specific date. You can also go to satellite imagery and topography, and you can actually check out ice roughness as well. You can see how Inuit Qayumaitukangit and science come together in one place where members of the community can access this information put there by other community members. Users of Siku can turn this information into opportunities for education, like teaching youth about wildlife observations and sea ice conditions and environmental stewardship. Which is going to take us to the app's guiding principles. When you agree to the terms and conditions, you're pledging to comply with the principles, which are that Siku 1, respects Indigenous knowledge, 2, builds capacity for Inuit communities to create solutions for environmental stewardship, resource management, and climate change adaptation, 3, that this information is under control of the community members and that they can grant who can access this information, and 4, that this information is promoting Inuit Qayumaitukangit, passing on traditional knowledge, such as safe ice conditions for traveling and preserving the language and culture. In addition, the Siku app itself has special data management and privacy settings that allow the users to control the information of each. So let's talk a little bit about the features of the app itself. Here's what the app looks like when you open it on your mobile device. And on the top right, you could see where you could start tracking. You could pause your tracking and finish your tracking. And you could even track out of cell phone range. And you can make wildlife observations or hunting posts, sea ice observations or resource observations. A large list of wildlife can be observed on the app. And if you want to make an observation, you just click on the animal. Click if you want to click on individual, group, tracks, family, or den. And if you want it to be a hunting story, you have to click on it, otherwise it'll just be an observation, and you fill out the information below. So this is an example of one of the posts that I made. You can see the geese that I harvested, their habitat they were in, method of harvest, and coordinates. You can also put in information such as stomach contents, measurements, and you could take samples. Another feature of this app is ice conditions. There is a list of different types of ice. You can find the description, photo, and Inuktitut name of each. You can see how Inuit knowledge can adapt on the app can additionally be used to teach users about ice. And because the app is currently in beta testing, if you want to look at other people's posts, you're going to have to go into the website. And this is under my account in Cambridge Bay, where I'm currently living. And you could see the observations made on the left, and you could see people's posts on the right on the map. And when I got home, I posted my tracks and observations from my app, and you were able to see it on the website. And you could see it here. In other communities like Sanikiluaq, sea ice postings are invaluable. In this post, someone noted some dangerous ice by taking a photo and saving the GPS locations. It appears to be the orange angel icon, and the user happened to see the crack before the satellite imagery even saw it. In fact, 2 days later, it became a drifting flow edge. You can see how example of Inuit Qayumaitukangit and science can work together to inform Siku users. In this case, the user was able to post the location of the dangerous ice before the satellite imagery displayed it. With the climate changing, it has become harder and harder for Inuit to predict ice conditions. And this is an example of how drastically things are changing in a short amount of time. And this can be dangerous, especially in the springtime when families are traveling on the ice together. And things like Siku make it much safer for Inuit to travel. And the user was able to know by looking at this ice that it was dangerous through his traditional knowledge and wanted to inform the other users in his community. These communities so far have profiles and are beta testing the app, and it'll be fully functional in the fall time and available throughout Inuit Nunangat, which is all the regions that Inuit inhabit. Inuit are very good at adapting. That is how we have thrived during the many changes of Inuit way of life. And this app is just one example of the technology era. This app will promote stewardship, knowledge transfer, and safer traveling in a rapidly changing climate. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Candace.
And just for those of you who don't know, the part that says the part that's underneath siku is a traditional way of spelling siku in my language. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I wanted just to ask Yannick a question about this connection between Indigenous knowledge, land use planning, and as we know, peatlands and permafrost knowledge is limited. We have a lot, but maybe it's not accessible to those people that are even living there. So how do we see these innovations of real-time monitoring, actually, of the environmental situation and links and communications, better communications between Indigenous people and scientists? And how then, Yannick, do you think this can really be useful for land use planning and decision making? And similar to this avoidance of this dangerous ice, how do we get this avoidance of this precious treasure we have, which are peatlands on permafrost?
Yeah, I think the number one approach here is the word respect. So a lot of it is about getting government, non-Indigenous people, non-Indigenous academics really re-educated and trained on how, I mean, this knowledge has been around since time immemorial. So it's really about re-educating and reprocessing our own systems in the non-Indigenous worldview side to sort of notice how can you walk with and be invited in to recognize and work with in partnership with the knowledge and experience that's available. So it's not, you don't want to turn it into some kind of an extraction approach, right, where government comes in and, oh yeah, we'd love all your knowledge and data, and we want to take that and we'll make better decisions. It really is a relationship piece, so not a, yeah, so I mean, that would be the biggest sort of message I would take as a first step. And then the second is when that relationship is there and the knowledge can flow both ways, right? I mean, a lot of it is about co-learning. How does that turn into new ways of designing policy? Again, policy right now in the non-Indigenous governance world is very segregated, very siloed, very separate. You might have a caribou policy, a tree forest policy in the boreal, then you might have a peatland policy, but they may be completely unlinked in conventional governance. So I think it's kind of, again, retransforming how we think about policy and then how we can work with the new relationships to kind of bring all that in.
Thanks. And Candice, did you want to add to that a little bit about how you think that these relationships are being built? You have also, besides Siku, an experience of helping that, how people in your community can speak and with scientists and others that are actually making decisions.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Just that besides Siku, you have other experience of trying to bring scientists together with your knowledge, the Indigenous knowledge. And I think that we do see, through technology, the collection of stories, not only scientific data, but the storytelling and the understanding of the environment that you live with. Can you tell a little bit about your experience in bridging these two languages?
So I'm part of this youth program. It's called Ikakvik, which means bridge or place of crossing. And what we're trying to do is trying to make a bridge between scientists and Inuit, because scientists haven't had always had the best relationship with Inuit, unfortunately. So this youth group is coming together to build a better bridge to kind of how we would like to see the scientists build better relationships with Inuit in these different communities. And I think this is very important, and we hope that in the future that scientists can will be able to better understand that Inuit aren't just polar bear guards. We're not just people you can hire to make sure you're doing your research safely, but you can also teach us about your research. You could teach us how to take these samples, and we could help you better understand the things that we know from on the land, and using our traditional knowledge to better help your research, and also your research can help us in the communities.
Thanks so much. And Hans, how do you think about the science on permafrost changing? You've traveled to some of these places, and you've probably seen through the years of your many, many years of studies, how are people changing their lives? And is that not only just about permafrost, but also peatlands? And do you think it's about the climate change, or is it more about the land use impacts, or what do you think is really sort of the driving in the far north?
I think that in many peatlands of the world, a lot of changes are attributed to climate change, but in fact they are more dominated by human activities. I think that the Arctic, to some extent, is an exception in this regard. And there are really processes that are triggered stronger by climate than by human activities. But human activities, of course, and climate, they interfere with each other. For example, with climate change, we see in the transition of taiga and tundra, of forest, the boreal forest and the open land, we see an increase in fire incidents. And that is, of course, carried by climate change, but it is, of course, also caused by human action. And the fact that the climate is making these ecosystems more sensitive must force us in a direction that we treat these ecosystems more careful. The time has disappeared that we can simply squander around with landscape. We have to be very careful. It is not necessarily so that all changes are negative, but the most important insight that I gained is that we actually do not know enough about what the effects are. There are so many contrasting effects, and there are so many rapid changes in space and time that it is very difficult to come with an integrated assessment of what all these things are meaning. So I think we have to be very careful when we are acting in such sensitive landscape where you have this peatland and permafrost enormous amounts of carbon that may be released or maybe also not, but we cannot take the risk that it is going into the wrong direction, because then when the carbon is mobilized, it will add substantially to climate change itself.
Thank you very much. Thank Hans. I'd like to invite Daria to give a presentation. She's going to talk a little bit about the experience of ecosystem restoration in Russia. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Daria Ryazantseva. I'm from Russia. I would like to introduce you the presentation about the approach and practice to indigenous people in engagement in actions for sustainable development, in particular ecological restoration projects in the Arctic. And let me tell you a few words about the company where I work at. Expert is an international consulting company and focuses on professional advisory services for business, non-profit sector, and governments. Our strategy is aimed at the development of projects on the ground with real actions for sustainable development. And our main interest in these projects, there are people. We often work in the Arctic, as now it's the region of special interest of the world, and particularly in Russia. The main landscape of Arctic is tundra with permafrost, which determines the conditions and lifestyle of people there. And the permafrost significance and vulnerability is usually admitted by all stakeholder groups, but who are stakeholders in Arctic? Some obvious interested parties in this region, there are indigenous people preserving traditional way of life and land use. Also local communities of small towns and rural settlements, including indigenous people and groups of Russian population, integrated in modern economy, but still much depend on nature-based ecosystem services, government bodies, ecological and human rights NGOs, and the scientists. And there are a lot of less obvious stakeholders in this region, such as seasonal workers from oil and gas companies and industrial companies, and their management engineers and specialists, international organizations, and political leaders. And the key point for understanding modern trends in stakeholder management in Arctic project is not only potential influence of different stakeholders on the Arctic climate should be evaluated, usually as harmful and negative, but vice versa. Lately, the influence of these changes on people's lifestyle has become significant. Many companies already have to invest significant resources in project planning and development, as well as maintaining favorable living conditions for people in a changing climate and melting permafrost. It creates new challenges to technical communication, transport, movement, and construction of new residential and industrial facilities. So that the short-term solution, such as one-time compensation measures by industrial company, couldn't solve the problem of changing the Tundra ecosystem. So that only systematic dialogue is a crucial condition for the successful project implementation in modern conditions. All stages of the projects must consider stakeholder interests, informing them and managing their expectations. Efficient dialogue couldn't be set up without essential knowledge level on Tundra ecosystem. At the same time, practice shows that traditional methods of environmental education often don't work. More efficient are practical training programs and workshops engaging stakeholders in the educational process. For example, in development teaching materials in close cooperation with indigenous people. Another way to improve interaction is to engage all stakeholders in a common activity. This may be brainstorming in project development, field works, researchers, and trainings. At the same time, we promote the gender approach consideration because the roles of men, women, and children in Tundra, they're unique and non-intersecting. Special attention should be paid to young people as when they participate in the project, they become interested persons and increase their motivation to stay on their land and develop it. I also want to tell you about Green Tundra initiatives showing the need for this particular approach. The project area is the northern part of Yamal Peninsula, Siahanskaya Tundra. The indigenous people of Yamal are Nenets, leading a nomadic lifestyle with traditional nature management such as reindeer hunters and fishing. 36 families are involved in economic activities in Siahanskaya Tundra, and also it is the area of project Yamal LNG. It's a gas production plant. In this region, there are a lot of problems associated with overgrazing of deer and deterioration of pasture quality. And recently, some families began to notice changes in the Tundra landscape, such as cracks in the ground and high water level inside the Earth's surface. And during our monitoring of the implementation of the indigenous peoples development plan, we work with Yamal LNG under this plan. Community representatives reported the observations and expressed their concerns about the state of permafrost, and they suggested restore the Tundra ecosystem. Just a second. It was good history because Yamal LNG supported this project, and our project team applied the ecological restoration method aimed at national ecosystem recovery in long-term perspective by means of scientifically based project development on the pilot site. And it will be a communication. It will be a platform for communication of all parties and discuss all environmental and social issues. Our strategy that we value not only the final results but the project's evaluation itself. And there are some benefits from climate-related initiatives from profit organizations. And there are projects which we aimed at achieving SDGs too. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Daria. As we can see that successful work is when people living together, not only just the communities living and from that region are speaking together. So more interaction, a lot more communication. Tatiana, I'll ask you to go up. And then we'll have a nice dialogue. We can also interact with everyone that's sitting there. Thanks so much.
Okay, morning, yeah, good morning. So, yeah, if possible, my presentation there. Okay, so I would like to bring you back to the problem of wetlands or peatlands on permafrost. And in reality, the wetlands is sort of a ghost which nobody recognized, but which is really steering this permafrost, as Hans already explained. Permafrost is something which is covering 25% of our world and some significant part of some countries, like 65% of Russian Federation, for example, or 55% of Canada. Yeah, so it is something that really should be known. But in reality, nobody knows what it is. Yeah? Very few people really know what's permafrost. And I would advise you to come to the webpage of the Alfred Weninger Institute in Germany, and they have very nice animation about what is permafrost in very easy way, saying what it is. For example, we always forget that permafrost is going very deep to the ground, but it doesn't help to protect it, because the most problem is this area, which is thawing. Yeah? And when you have no connection between surface and this deep part of permafrost, this is where our trouble starts. So there's three key basic processes in permafrost which are natural: this cracking, mounding, and thermokarst, which are identifying the whole diversity of wetlands or peatlands, which are connected to permafrost. Hans already referred to this, so I will not stop this, but they have very specific features, which also is nice to know when you start to do something with your ecosystem, how this works. But the most area on permafrost is the shallow peat areas in Arctic. And those areas nobody recognizes because they call them Tundra, yeah? And they don't understand that they function also like peatlands. And their main thing is to protect this peat. So in reality, wetlands have not been recognized in Arctic many years. CAF, Program of Arctic Council, which is dealing with biodiversity, had nothing about wetlands and no word wetland in their documents. But luckily in 2012 there was the memorandum between CAF and Ramsar, and then the Arctic Wetland Project started, funded by the Swedish government, and more or less wetlands became on the agenda. There's the wetland book, the encyclopedia, which was published recently in 2018, and we produced very primitive classification about wetlands in Arctic, that every body who wants to pasture reindeers or drill Arctic be aware where he can find which type of wetland and how to deal with this. And if you don't understand how to deal with wetland, you have real problems, because maybe the impact of oil and gas industry is very located, but it is distributed in masses. Yeah. So, and those are the worst example of this impact on permafrost. Just destroying this small peat layer, 15 centimeters of peat, and then you have the enter point where the permafrost start to thaw. And the traditional use also becomes not traditional because it is industrialized. Never ever there was so much reindeers in some areas like now. Yeah. So also the problem. And then you have this, and this looks like desert, but it is Arctic, and this is the subject of the Convention of Desertification, maybe to look at. Yeah. And there are experiments on restoration, as Daria told, but there's no incentives for restoration because in reality, this permafrost and those Arctic wetlands, they are not under convention, not under climate convention, very few in Ramsar Convention. CAF also started to care like 2 years ago, so it's very difficult situation. And there is the country on this globe where my heart lives. And this is the example what could become with Arctic when we really don't care. Yeah? And this country is Mongolia. And Mongolia is in the transition between two large permafrost spots. Yeah, the Siberian permafrost and the Tibetan plateau permafrost. And this is permafrost on the edge. And the sad story about this is that this permafrost is shrinking and thawing very fast. These are two maps, and between them, this is 50 years. And in 50 years, this permafrost had reduced 50 times. Unfortunately, this was not published in decent paper, and that's why we can't use it for the political reasons, but the team of Mongolian team of Dr. Jabal Jaf promised me, frankly, to do it this year. So, and surprise, surprise, together with the permafrost, there's 50% of shrinkage of peatlands, which before covered 1.7% of Mongolia. Yeah. So, and this is coming all together. And who is first and who is second, as Hans told, this is the dialectic problem, but we don't care who is first and who is second, because the disappearance of both is very bad for the country, because for the country is last drinking water storage is in permafrost, and peatlands are the last pastures, productive pastures. So, and this is how it is. This is overgrazing. This is also changing the traditional grazing to Kashmir production, industrialization of grazing. This is mining. This is road construction, not looking at the peatland, and there's the fires. And this is what brought this situation which I told you about. And surprise, surprise, restoration is possible. We have also a restoration project there. But again, where is the incentives? So we could look for incentive in the climate convention, yeah? But the problem is that, yes, we know how much gigatons is stored of carbon is stored in the permafrost, but for example, the peatland carbon network, yeah, they show a huge increase of the publications on peatland and carbon, but the information is so contradicting that there is very hardly possible to make any good science from this in which we can feed the climate convention. Yeah? So this is the wetland ghost and the guy who is trying to measure with chamber, and this is absolutely useless because the chamber measurements are so contradictory here. So, and this was the picture, this is the picture which is illustrating this article of Christian Shadow of 2016, which really shows that there's so many processes that you can't say when it becomes sink, when it's source. So forgot about climate convention. So I suggest that we really look at SDGs and come to this, because the permafrost is something which is defining the lifestyle of people there, the microclimate, the climate, and just the habitat. So this is the driving factor for the habitat in the areas where it was before, yeah, or it is still. So, and keeping the permafrost in, using wetlands, using peatlands as a safeguard, this is the strategy. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Tatiana. I'd like to invite up our guest, Mr. Bajikal. Would you like to join us here, Dr.? And while you come up, I'd love to ask you, as all the work that you've been doing in Mongolia, the Mongolian government, can you share a little bit about what solutions are in mind? Come and sit down, we're going to have a conversation. Thanks very much. So, what solutions do you have in mind on the challenges of permafrost and peatlands in Mongolia?
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to apologize because I was attending outdoor meeting and I couldn't listen to all the speakers and all the small part of Tatiana's presentation. But in Mongolia, you know, the peatland, in terms of size, is very small. And traditionally, people think about peatland not in respect of greenhouse gas and so on. Only last piece of land when everywhere drought and nothing to eat for animal, peatland is last, like refugee for livestock, because as you know in Mongolia, livestock pasture-based. But nowadays, thanks to the scientist effort, including Dr. Tatiana Anieva, we had some project, small one, supported by ADB. Now we know what does mean peatland in Mongolia. And it is a very important piece of land in relation with ecosystem service and many factors which about we have to think and try to protect this piece of land. And
Thanks very much. I wanted to turn to our audience, if our audience had any questions for the panel. We can have some interactive discussions and questions. Anyone in the audience have a question? Otherwise, I'm sure the panel members have many questions for each other. Yannick, do you have a question that you wanted to ask someone? I think it's what we're really seeing here. It's not just about climate change. It's really about land use and land use change and the impacts of choices. And if we're not speaking to people that are using the land and seeing it change and making the decisions about how it changes, and they're not informed, I mean, we really don't even know where all peatlands are. And we're working together as a Global Peatlands Initiative to try to establish this global inventory. But we also need to have people that are looking at how they're changing. And that means, especially in the far north, where people, the indigenous people are the only ones living there, that they have such a critical role to play and also to share their ideas about how to use these places more appropriately and more sustainably.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually curious a little bit maybe to because we have a bit of a country representative here as well, if you had that one first step you think would be absolutely most beneficial to Mongolia with respect to the peatlands, what would that first step If you had a magic wand and you could do anything, what do you think would be the most catalytic first step?
If you understood correctly, what is most important first step dealing with peatland in Mongolia? First of all, I think people should understand the value of peatland. And unfortunately, in Mongolia, traditionally people rely on nature and never think that sometimes the pressure because of human activities can exceed the capacity of land. Traditionally, they think that land is a very powerful thing. We can do everything, and land can have enough capacity. But land has enough capacity while usually lifestyle was mostly livestock, for example, subsistence economy farm. But there is livestock in Mongolia no more subsistence economy, it's cash economy. And now people want to have more livestock because they want to make some profit additionally and so on. And therefore, we cannot rely only capacity nature, but people, if they made some harm, people in compensation should do something. And it is even not only just local community, but also government, the local government and central government. And we should include something about peatland on the national program like climate change. We have also so-called green development policy and sustainable development, many kind of documents. But unfortunately, most of them have 1-2 sentences on peatland, but not much guaranteed for implementation because of capacity, knowledge, and also, of course, financial issue.
And I think we've heard, thank you so much, about that with Indonesia. Indonesia's been an absolute champion in sharing their hard-learned lessons about the challenges of their peatland degradation, and had been also an inspiration to establishing the Global Peatlands Initiative and talking to each other and sharing, we can't get back what you've lost in Mongolia, but what we really need to know is what we can't touch in other places, that people don't necessarily know that these peatlands are there. They maybe call them different names, wetlands, fens, mires, bogs, blanket bogs. There's so many different names, Tundra, that people are not really understanding the full impact, the triple wins that peatlands have to offer, the resilience that they offer communities and people. And maybe Hans, you can share a little bit more about what you know about them and how can we really commit to, when we're going towards the Secretary General's Climate Summit and all these other big climate summit discussions, peatlands really are that ideal nature-based solution. They offer those triple wins.
Yeah, in the Arctic and at all in permafrost areas, as Tanya already stressed, peat layers do not necessarily have to be so thick. A lot of areas have only peat layers of a few decimeters, less than the normal definition of a peatland. So they are not recognized as lands with peat, and that is therefore a pity, you can say, because if you know that 15 centimeters of peat has already more carbon than a high carbon stock rainforest, we make correctly, of course, a lot of fuss about the protection of rainforest and their carbon, but that these shallow peat layers have the same amount of carbon that has to be protected, that is not so easily recognized. That has to do with the definition of peatlands, 30, 40 centimeters, and then otherwise it are not peatlands. So a lot, tens of percent, 30, 40% of the Arctic has peat layers thinner than the definition of peatland. Although they have a substantial amount of carbon. And that has to be recognized because people think when it is small, it is not important, but it is very dense.
Thanks for that. Anyone else have a question? Does anyone in the audience? Yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Charlotte. I'm with UNEP WCMC. I'd like to thank all the speakers for the presentations. Very interesting. I had a question, I guess, to Daria to begin with, but maybe the other panelists have some opinions on this as well. You talked about the Green Tundra initiative, and I saw that Yamal LNG was one of the partners in that initiative. And some of you have mentioned the increasing impacts of changes in permafrost for the private sector as well. And I was wondering, what is the role of the private sector in this conversation, and has there been any changes in the way that private sector is viewing what is happening in the Arctic?
Okay, thank you for your question. My English is not pretty well, I'm sorry. The role of private sector is very important in Yamal Peninsula and in all part of Arctic of Russian Federation, and so that it's very important to start talk with these companies because we often think that they are bad, don't interest in interests of indigenous peoples and that's all. But we want to start project when we can communicate with all stakeholder groups in Arctic, and in the first with oil and gas companies. So that what Yamal LNG project, it's in Russia, it's one of the first companies who decided to do to go on another way. And the traditional method of restoration projects from oil and gas companies, it's grass growing, but we apply another way, and because we were communicate with them near 8 years, so that they supported this idea. They supported ideas that from local communication, and they already financed that, took finance, and we want to show this approach for another oil and gas companies from Russia and replicate it in future. Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I think that we are getting more and more private sector that are becoming increasingly aware. For example, restoration doesn't mean just put it back to green, lush grass, tall trees, in places where these things never grew before. So I think that conversation with and reliance on scientists and practitioners that understand the dynamics of these unique places like peatlands is so critical. And then the sensitization and informing and communicating with people that are living there. They might love that lush grass for their herds, but that's really not a long-term solution for their livelihoods and also for the health and well-being of their animals. Alban, you had a question? Thanks.
So, good morning, everybody. Alban Kisife is my name. I'm from the International Climate Initiative of the German Ministry for the Environment. Thank you very much for your brilliant presentations. The question I have goes actually to Hans Houston. I actually got stuck when you mentioned that very little research has been done so far on the peatlands in the permafrost, and that it's not actually very clear if these changes are anthropogenic or actually natural, but then it is important that we actually keep track of these changes. So my question is actually, what would be your recommendation? Is it like, do we actually set peatlands in permafrost on a high agenda for climate debates, or it is like, do we need to invest more on research to actually find out these dynamics, what are the interplays in the peatlands of permafrost, so that maybe we're acting on a precautionary basis, the precautionary principle, although we do not really have found that information on these dynamics, but then it's better to actually already go upfront with precautionary measures. Thank you very much.
The fact that we do not know much, and certainly not everything, about permafrost peatlands and carbon in permafrost should not keep us back of doing wrong. No, we should take care of doing not wrong things. The precautionary principle is a very important principle, certainly when there are possibilities for major catastrophes. We know that there is an enormous amount of carbon over there. We know that with permafrost melting, the areas become wetter. So part of this carbon will be mobilized as methane. We know also that as a result of the wetness, carbon sequestration will increase. But the overall picture is not completely clear. We had 2 years ago a World Permafrost Congress in Potsdam, and there was also a workshop where we discussed the policy implications of science. And then one of the questions is, can we as joint permafrost experts say what the climate effect will be of permafrost thawing? And after some hours of discussion, we came to the conclusion we cannot say in which direction it is going. And you can be assured by that, but I get very afraid by that. If you have such a bomb laying somewhere, a bomb is very nice to have in your house as long nobody puts fire on the fuse. But if you do not know what is happening, you better take care that the bomb is not going to explode. So I think therefore you have to take a precautionary approach, even when there is chance that part of the permafrost melting will lead to more carbon sequestration because of increased peat formation. We cannot take the risk that it goes in the wrong direction because there are positive feedbacks in this issue. We do not have, of course, a lot of studies have been done in permafrost. It is not so that we do not know anything, but the monitoring of the development of permafrost is rather scarce. It is not a circumpolar coverage. There are really big gaps in the monitoring system that have to be filled. As I said, 30% of all studies come from 30 kilometers from two places on Earth, Tulik and Abisko, one created because of the Prudhoe Bay oil pipeline, and the other because it is next to a railway that is serving the biggest iron mine on Earth. So you see what the selection criteria is. This is not a good base of having a good overview. So we must prioritarily develop this monitoring system, but until we know more, we should apply a precautionary principle.
Yeah, I think we know that these are very special places, and we need to learn to use them differently, use them wet, use them in their, and value them for actually all those services that they provide. We are one quick bit, and then I need to wrap it up, and we
just to add to what Hans told, the problem also in this science of permafrost is that scientists of different branches are not speaking to each other. Yeah, this is the impressive permafrost scientists network. They did a lot in this polar year. The network of stations and the measurements is huge, and there is a lot of data. But this real permafrost scientists, they never speak to the scientists who are doing something on the surface. And this is a problem. Really, the points where the monitoring is integrative, so all components is very limited to these 2 points. Yeah, so.
And I think countries asked us for that actually at the United Nations Environment Assembly in March this year, where they have an international resolution on the conservation and sustainable management of peatlands. They called for interdisciplinary science. They talked about intersectoral collaboration and many stakeholders having a valid voice at the table. And I think that these ecosystems, peatlands, they're absolute treasures. I want to just do a quick wrap up because we have still the launch of the book to do. I wanted to say that, Hans, you shared with us the peatlands and permafrost science. We know a little bit more about where they're important and unique. Yannick, you mentioned that if we don't include and empower Indigenous voices to bring their traditional knowledge to decision makers, the decision making is going to be ill-informed and incomplete. We'll also lose time and really reduce the potential for high impact action, whether that be climate action, conservation action, or really for the resilience of communities and people. Candice, you shared an example of innovation. Thank you so much for that. A high-tech tool that's meeting the needs of your community. It also is helping to build some sort of common language or actually learn how to collect your stories, your people's way of collecting data and sharing information. And that's quite remarkable. Amazing the power of technology that we can actually now use big data sources like that. We can use the voice, the words, and the stories, and that's quite important. Daria, you shared about land use planning. Thanks very much. And the implications of decisions that were made incomplete on less than consultative information. You shared a little bit about the work going on ecosystems restoration and how relying on the participation of many stakeholders and the information and advice from scientists and critically from traditional knowledge of that place. Tatiana, you really highlighted your passion and really the urgency. Why is it so urgent to make decisions and to call to action people to make good, well-informed development decisions, prioritize and choose high-impact, low-tech, fabulous places like peatlands to do your work in and around? You also shared the risk and the future for people if we lose peatlands on permafrost and the impacts that's had for Mongolia. So thank you so much for also sharing that, Mongolia is going to be suffering because of the loss of that peatlands. The groundwater is shrinking and the tundra is changing. I wanted to say that wherever you find them, whatever you call them, peatlands are an absolute powerhouse ecosystem, and we must acknowledge that. They're an incredible nature-based solution for climate action. They're for the planet, its biodiversity, unique and rare. And they're for health, water quality, resilience. They're for all people, including Indigenous people and all of our future generations. And I think we really are going to lose the protection, this blanket that we have in the north if we lose those peatlands. And the protection for our climate, the protection for our people, the drinking water, and the unique resilience that these peatlands offer us locally and globally. So we're not just talking about climate change, we're talking about choices, land use change. Both things are impacting permafrost, they're impacting peatlands, and they're impacting people. I want to just take one moment to launch the publication. where 500 scientists from around the world highlighted peatlands as one of the most urgent and important emerging issues of our time. And we have our author here, Hans Houston. Thank you so much for your work that you're doing, as well as those incredible peer reviewers that shared their knowledge and made sure that the message was clear. So I want to take an opportunity here to present everyone with those Frontiers books, and also then to invite everyone to really engage with our unique and diverse speakers here that have very different perspectives, and everyone's voice is really important. So thank you so much for sharing with us today.